Ashneate, Ashneate, hey, yate, 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 Ashneate, yate, yate.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about half an hour of history together. My name is Jason Kishineff, and we're reading Chapter 5 of An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. Remember, if you like the show, if you like the episode, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button and the notification bell as well, so you get notified each time I make a new video. Let's dig in. Chapter 5, The Birth of a Nation. And there's a quotation from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at the beginning. Our nation was born in genocide. We are perhaps the only nation which tried as a matter of national policy to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated that tragic experience into a noble crusade. Indeed, even today we have not permitted ourselves to reject or feel remorse for this shameful episode. Martin Luther King Jr. The British withdrew from the fight to maintain their 13 colonies in 1783 in order to redirect their resources to the conquest of South Asia. The British East India Company had been operating in the subcontinent since 1600 in a parallel project to Britain's colonization of the North American Atlantic coast. Britain's transfer to the United States of its claim to the Ohio country spelled a nightmarish disaster for all indigenous peoples east of the Mississippi. Britain's withdrawal in 1783 did not end military actions against indigenous peoples, but rather was a prelude to unrestrained, violent colonization of the continent. In negotiations to end the war, Britain did not insist on consideration for the indigenous nations that resisted the settlers' war of succession. In the resulting 1783 Treaty of Paris, the Crown transferred to the United States ownership of all its territory south of the Great Lakes, from the Mississippi to the Atlantic, and north of Spanish-occupied Florida. Muskogee Creek leader Alexander McGillivray expressed the general indigenous view: to find ourselves in country betrayed to our enemies and divided between the Spaniards and Americans is cruel and ungenerous. The New Order. Wars continued for another century, unrelentingly and without pause, and the march across the continent used the same strategy and tactics of scorched earth and annihilation with increasingly deadly firepower. Somehow, even genocide seems an inadequate description for what happened. Yet rather than viewing it with horror, most Americans have conceived of it as their country's manifest destiny. With the consolidation of the new state, the United States of America, by 1790, the opportunity for indigenous nations to negotiate alliances with competing European empires against the despised settlers who intended to destroy them was greatly narrowed. Nevertheless, indigenous nations had defied the founding of the independent United States in a manner that allowed for their survival and created a legacy, a culture of resistance that had persisted By the time of the birth of the U.S. Republic, indigenous peoples in what is now the continental United States had been resisting European colonization for 2 centuries. They had no choice given the aspirations of the colonizers, total elimination of native nations, or survival. Pre-colonial indigenous societies were dynamic social systems with adaptation built into them. Fighting for survival did not require cultural abandonment. On the contrary, the cultures used already existing strengths, such as diplomacy and mobility, to develop new mechanisms required to live in nearly constant crisis. There was always a hard core of resistance in that process, but the culture of resistance also includes accommodations to the colonizing social order, including absorbing Christianity into already existing religious practices, using the colonizers' language, and intermarrying with settlers, and more importantly with other oppressed groups such as escaped African slaves. Without the culture of resistance, surviving indigenous peoples under U.S. colonization would have been eliminated through individual assimilation. This is Hermione, in case you're not a regular viewer. A new element was added in the independent Anglo-American legal regime, treaty making. The U.S. Constitution specifically refers to indigenous nations only once, but significantly. In Article 1, Section 8, Congress shall have power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. In the federal system, we already know how that goes. In the federal system, in which all powers not specifically reserved for the federal government go to the states, relations with indigenous nations are unequivocally a federal matter. Although not mentioned as such, native peoples are implied in the Second Amendment. Male settlers have been required in the colonies to serve in militias during their lifetimes for the purpose of raiding and raising indigenous communities. The southern colonies included in later states, militias were used as slave patrols. Don't rip my pants. The Second Amendment, ratified in 1791, enshrined these irregular forces into law, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Oh, there's a lot of talk about that one lately. The continuing significance of that freedom, specified in the Bill of Rights, reveals the settler colonialist cultural roots of the United States that appear even in the present as a sacred right. U.S. genocidal wars against indigenous nations continued unabated in the 1790s and were woven into the very fabric of the new nation state. The fears, aspirations, and greed of Anglo-American settlers on the borders of indigenous territories perpetuated this warfare and influenced the formation of the U.S. Army, much as the demands and actions of backcountry settlers had shaped the colonial militias in North America. Owners of large slave-worked plantations sought to expand their land holdings, while small farm owners who were unable to compete with the planters and were pushed off their land now desperately sought cheap land to support their families. The interests of both settler groups were in tension with those of state and military authorities who sought to build a new professional military based on Washington's army. Just as the U.S. government and its army were taking form, a number of settlements on the peripheries of indigenous nations threatened to secede. Not succeed, secede, as in leave the country, prompting the army to make rapid expansion into indigenous territories a top priority. Brutal counterinsurgency warfare would be the key to the army's destruction of the indigenous people's civilization in the Ohio country and the rest of what was then called the Northwest over the first quarter century of U.S. independence. Total war in Ohio sets the stage. The first Washington administration was consumed by the crisis engendered by its inability to quickly conquer and colonize the Ohio country over which it claimed sovereignty. During the Confederation period, before the U.S. Constitution was written and ratified, the indigenous nations in that region had access to a constant supply of British arms and had formed effective political and military alliances. The first of them forged by Mohawk leader Joseph Brant during the 1780s. Washington's administration determined that only war Washington's administration determined that only war, not diplomacy, would break up the indigenous alliances. Secretary of War Henry Knox told the Army commander of Fort Washington, where Cincinnati is today, that to extend a defensive and efficient protection to so extensive a frontier against solitary or small parties of enterprising savages seems altogether impossible. No other remedy remains but to extirpate utterly, if possible, the said banditti. These orders could not be implemented with a conventional army engaged in regular warfare. Although federal officers commanded the army, the fighters were nearly all drawn from militias made up primarily of squatter settlers from Kentucky. They were unaccustomed to army discipline, but fearless and willing to kill to get a piece of land to grab, or some scalps for bounty. The army found the Miami villages they planned to attack already deserted. So they set up a base in one of the villages and waited for a Miami assault. But the assault was not forthcoming. When the commander sent out small units to find the Miamis, these search and destroy missions were ambushed and sent fleeing by allied Miamis and Shawnees over the leadership of Little Turtle. Meshekinoqua. I hope I pronounced that right. And Blue Jacket. Wea Pearsonwa. The deserted towns had been bait to lure the invaders into ambushes. The commander reported to the War Department that his forces had burned 300 buildings and destroyed 20,000 bushels of corn. Those were likely facts, but his claim to have broken up the indigenous political and military organization was not accurate. Knox apparently knew that more than food and property destruction would be needed to quell resistance. He ordered the commanders to recruit 500 weathered Kentucky mounted rangers to burn and loot Miami towns and fields along the Wabash River. They were to capture women and children as hostages to use as terms of surrender. In carrying out these orders, the marauding rangers demonstrated what they could accomplish with unmitigated violence and a total lack of scruples, and respect for non-combatants. They destroyed the Miami's two largest towns and took 41 women and children captive. They sent warnings to the other towns that the same would be their lot unless they surrendered unconditionally. And here's a quotation. Your warriors will be slaughtered, your towns and villages ransacked and destroyed, your wives and children carried into captivity, and you may be assured that those who escape the fury of our mighty chiefs shall find no resting place on this side of the Great Lakes. Yet the Indians of the Ohio country continued to fight, well aware of the likely consequences. The Seneca leader, corn planter, what? Get off! The Seneca leader, corn planter, called the colonizers the town destroyers. He described how during the destruction and suffering that troops wreaked on the western Iroquois, Seneca women looked behind them and turned pale, and our children cling close to the necks of their mothers. She gets weird and attacks me sometimes. I don't want to be attacked while I'm reading to you. Despite the primary use of settler militias, President Washington insisted that the new government had to develop a professional army that would enhance U.S. prestige in the eyes of European countries. He also thought that the cost of using mercenaries at 4 times that of regular troops was too high. But whenever regular troops were sent into the Ohio country, the indigenous resistors drove them out. Reluctantly, Washington resigned himself to the necessity of using what were essentially vicious killers to terrorize the region, thereby annexing land that could be sold to settlers. The sale of confiscated land was the primary revenue source for the new government. In late 1791, the War Department notified Ohio squatters to call out their rangers for an offensive. Major General Mad Anthony Wayne was charged with restructuring the units of the army under his command to function as irregular forces. Washington and other officials were aware that Wayne was unreliable and an alcoholic, but it appeared that such characteristics might be useful for the dirty war ahead. Between 1792 and 1794, Wayne put together a combined force of regulars with a large contingent of experienced rangers. He enthusiastically embraced such counterinsurgent tactics as destroying food supplies and murdering civilians. Among the 1,500 mounted rangers in the first mission was the talented William Wells with his group of rangers. When he was 13, Wells had been captured by the Miamis and then had lived with them for 9 years, marrying Little Turtle's daughter. Under his father-in-law's command, Wells had fought the invading settlers and the U.S. Army. Wow. In 1792, Wells was chosen to represent the Miami nation in a negotiation with the United States. But on arrival for talks, he encountered a brother from the family he had been separated from for a decade. He was persuaded to return to Kentucky and served as a ranger for the U.S. Army. Wayne's troops and rangers managed to enter the Ohio country and establish a base they called Fort Defiance in northwestern Ohio, in what had been the heart of the Indigenous alliance led by Little Turtle. Wayne then made an ultimatum to the Shawnees In pity of your innocent women and children, come and prevent the further effusion of your blood. The Shawnee leader Blue Jacket refused submission, and the U.S. forces began destroying Shawnee villages and fields and murdering women, children, and old men. On August 20th, 1794, at Fallen Timbers, the main Shawnee fighting force was overpowered. Even after this U.S. victory, the Rangers continued for 3 days, laying waste to Shawnee houses and cornfields. After creating a 50-mile swath of devastation, the invading forces returned to Fort Defiance. The defeat at Fallen Timbers was a severe blow to the indigenous nations of the Ohio country, but they would reorganize their resistance during the following decade. The U.S. conquest, even, of southern Ohio was formalized in the 1795 Treaty of Greenville, a victory based on vicious irregular warfare. The nations of the region no longer had the British and the French and the settlers to play against one another, but rather were now faced with the determined imperialist thrust of an independent republic that had to coddle settlers if they were to recruit any into their service. Tecumseh. Over the following decade, more settlers poured over the Appalachians, squatting on indigenous lands and even building towns, anticipating that the U.S. military, land speculators, and civilian institutions would follow. In the Ohio country, the Shawnee brothers Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa began building a concerted indigenous resistance in the early 19th century. From their organizing center, Prophetstown, founded in 1807, Tenskwatawa and his fellow organizers traveled through Shawnee towns calling for a return to their cultural roots, which had been eroded by the assimilation of Anglo-American practices and trade goods, especially alcohol. Abuse of alcohol and drugs is epidemic like diseases in communities subjected to colonization or other forms of domination, particularly in crowded and miserable refugee situations. This is the case in all parts of the world, not only among native peoples of North America. Alcohol was an item in the toolkit of colonialists who made it readily and cheaply available. Christian missionaries often took advantage of these dysfunctional conditions to convert, offering not only food and housing but also discipline to avoid alcohol. But this was itself a form of colonial submission. Significantly, Tecumseh did not limit his vision to the Ohio country, but also envisaged organizing all the peoples west to the Mississippi, north into the Great Lakes region, and south to the Gulf of Mexico. He visited other indigenous nations, calling for unity in defiance of the squatters' presence on their lands. He presented a program that would end all sales of indigenous land to settlers. Only then would settlers' migrations in search of cheap land cease, and the establishment of the United States in the West be prevented. An alliance of all indigenous nations could then manage indigenous lands as a federation, His program, strategy, and philosophy marked the beginning of a pan-indigenous movement in Anglo-colonized North America that established a model for future resistance. Joseph Brant and Pontiac had originated the strategy in the 1780s, but Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa forged a pan-indigenous framework made all the more potent by combining indigenous spirituality and politics while respecting the particular religions and languages of each nation. The evolving Indigenous alliance posed a serious barrier to continued Anglo-American squatting and land speculation and acquisitions in the Trans-Appalachian region. With previous indigenous resistance movements such as those led by Little Turtle and Blue Jacket during peace negotiations in the wake of ruinous U.S. wars of annihilation, leaders of factions had become agency chiefs who agreed to land sales without the consent of those they purported to represent. The colonized communities had fallen into economic dependency on trade goods and federal annuities, incurring debts that led to the forfeiture of what land remained in their hands. The emerging younger generation was contemptuous of such chiefs, whom they perceived as selling out their people. Anglo-American settlers and speculators exerted increased pressure and issued new threats of annihilation, provoking anger and calls for retaliation, but also a renewed spirit of resistance. By 1810, new indigenous alliances challenged squatter settlers in the Indiana and Illinois territories at a time when war between the United States and Great Britain was looming. Fearing that the British would unite with the indigenous alliances to prevent the U.S. imperialist goal to dominate the continent, these settlers drafted a petition to President James Madison demanding that the government act preemptively. And this is a quote: "The safety of the persons and property of this frontier can never be effectually secured but by the breaking up of the combination formed by the Shawnee Prophet on the Wabash." In 1809, Indiana's territorial governor, William Henry Harrison, badgered and bribed a few destitute Delaware, Miami, and Potawatomi individuals to sign the Treaty of Fort Wayne, according to which these nations would hand over their land in what is now southern Indiana for an annual annuity. Tecumseh promptly condemned the treaty and those who signed it without the approval of the peoples they represented. One has to wonder about how much they might have been tortured in order to get them to sign a treaty they had no right to sign. Yeah, I'm jumping to conclusions, but I think it's a logical one. Harrison met with Tecumseh at Vincennes in 1810 along with other delegates of the allied Shawnee, Kickapoo, Wyandot, Peoria, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Winnebago nations. The Shawnee leader informed Harrison that he was leaving for the south to bring the Muskogees, Choctaws, and Chickasaws into the alliance. Harrison, now convinced that Tecumseh's brother Tenskwatawa, the prophet, was the source of the renewed indigenous militancy, reasoned that destroying Prophet's town would crush the resistance. It would present a clear choice to the many indigenous peoples who supported the militant leaders cede more land to the United States and take the money and trade goods, or suffer further annihilation. He decided to strike in Tecumseh's absence, having served as General Wayne's aide-de-camp in the Fallen Timbers attacks. Harrison knew how to keep his regular army forces from being ambushed. He assembled Indiana and Kentucky Rangers, seasoned Indian killers, and some Army regulars at the site of what is today Terre Haute, Indiana. The soldiers constructed Fort Harrison on Shawnee land, a symbol of their intention to remain permanently. The people in Prophetstown were aware of the military advance, but Tecumseh had warned them not to be drawn into a fight because the alliance was not yet ready for war. Tenskwatawa sent scouts to observe the enemy's movements. The U.S. forces arrived on the edge of Prophetstown at dawn on November 6th, 1811. Seeing no alternative to overriding his brother's instructions, Tenskwatawa led an assault before dawn the following morning. Only after some 200 of the indigenous residents had fallen did the troops overpower them, burning the town, destroying the granary, and looting, even digging up graves and mutilating the corpses. Why? Just to upset them, I imagine. This was the famous Battle of Tippecanoe that made Harrison a frontier hero to the settlers and later helped elect him president. The U.S. Army's destruction of the capital of the Alliance outraged indigenous peoples all over the Old Northwest, prompting fighters of the Kickapoos, Winnebagos, Potawatomis, and even Creeks from the south to converge on a British garrison at Fort Malden in Canada to obtain supplies with which to fight. Contrary to the false U.S. assumption that Tecumseh was a mere tool of the British, he had been unwilling to enter into a British alliance because Europeans had proved so unreliable in the past. But now he spoke for unified and coordinated indigenous-led war on the United States that the British could support if they wished, but not control. President Madison, speaking to Congress in seeking a declaration of war against Great Britain, argued, why? President Madison, speaking to Congress in seeking a declaration of war against Great Britain, argued, in reviewing the conduct of Great Britain toward the United States, our attention is necessarily drawn to the warfare just renewed by the savages on one of our extensive frontiers. A warfare which is known to spare neither age nor sex, and to be distinguished by features peculiarly shocking to humanity. During the summer of 1812, the Indigenous Alliance struck U.S. installations and squatter settlements with little help from the British. The U.S. forts at present-day Detroit and Dearborn fell. Among the inhabitants of Fort Dearborn, Kentucky Ranger William Wells was killed and his body mutilated as that of a despised turncoat. In the fall, indigenous forces attacked Anglo-American squatter settlements all over Illinois and Indiana territories. The U.S. Rangers, attempting to track and kill the indigenous fighters, found destroyed and abandoned Anglo-American settlements with thousands of settlers driven from their homes. In response, Harrison turned the militias loose on indigenous fields and villages with no restrictions on their behavior. the head of the Kentucky militia, mustered 2,000 armed and mounted volunteers to destroy indigenous towns near today's Peoria, Illinois, but without success. I wasn't expecting that part. A reversal came in the fall of 1813 when Tecumseh was killed in the Battle of the Thames and the indigenous army was destroyed. Throughout the 18-month war, militias and rangers attacked indigenous civilians and agricultural resources, leaving behind starving refugees. Alright, well, let's end the chapter. Well, let's end the episode there, not the chapter. We'll end the chapter in the next episode. But thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like and subscribe button, and we'll see you next time.